本集节目由永丰金控冠名赞助，翻转金融，共创美好生活，以新闻开启国际视野。永丰金控与您一同掌握全球脉动。
It's very nice to see you again, Professor Mearsheimer. You have been visiting Taiwan in 2013. Hope that you can come back again to see what's going on in Taiwan.
I would like very much to do that.
Okay, let's begin with your new book, The Great Delusion. You are known as a realist. Why do you want to write a book discussing liberalism?
Well, I believe that with the coming of unipolarity in 1991, this is after the Cold War had ended and after the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States was the only great power on the planet. And the United States, because it had no rival great powers, was free to pursue a liberal foreign policy, what I call liberal hegemony. And I believe that that foreign policy, which the United States pursued from roughly 1989 up until 2017, when President Trump moved into the White House, had disastrous consequences for the United States. And I was very interested in understanding what liberal hegemony was all about and why it had failed so abysmally. And it was for that reason, in good part, that I wrote the book.
The liberal hegemony, as you mentioned, can be defined as a policy of remaking the world in Americans' image of a liberal democracy or regime change for certain countries. Do you still believe that United States had given up, still keep this idea of a regime change, or it had given up after several failed attempts?
Well, I think that liberal hegemony is no more.
Okay.
Because the world is no longer unipolar. You can only pursue a liberal foreign policy in a unipolar world where there's no rival great power and realpolitik does not apply. We now live in a multipolar world where the United States has a conflictual relationship with China and a conflictual relationship with Russia. And therefore, the United States must operate according to the dictates of realism, not liberalism. So liberal hegemony, in a very important way, is history.
But your book was first published in 2018 during the Trump administration. What does it tell us about the current Biden administration, especially it's a Democrat administration and they are more prone to have this kind of liberal regime as you defined it?
There's no question that Joe Biden, when he was vice president of the United States under Barack Obama, and when he, before that, was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was a deeply committed proponent of liberal hegemony. And he fully supported this liberal foreign policy. But then, with the coming of multipolarity around 2017, and the reemergence of realpolitik thinking in the American foreign policy elite, it became impossible to think about continuing to pursue liberal hegemony. So when Joe Biden became president in 2021, in January of 2021, what he did with regard to China was not to pursue engagement, which had characterized U.S.-China relations during the unipolar moment, and which Vice President Biden and Chairman Biden of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee had embraced. He no longer, when he became president, embraced engagement, and in fact, he embraced containment. He followed in the footsteps of President Trump. So you see that Joe Biden underwent a fundamental transformation in his thinking about general foreign policy, but in particular, general US foreign policy, but in particular about how the United States should deal with China. When he was vice president and when he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he was an arch proponent of engagement, which is a liberal foreign policy. Then, when he became president, because the structure of the world had changed and we had moved from unipolarity to multipolarity and realism was back on the table, he embraced containment, not engagement.
So would you say that the summit they just had in Bali between Xi and Biden, somehow they reach a consensus of mutual respect? Is that a way of Biden saying that we are not going to pursue a regime change in your country then?
No. I mean, the United States is not going to pursue regime change in China. That's just not possible.
Okay.
The United States is going to live with President Xi in charge in China. There's nothing that we can do about that. And in fact, it would be remarkably foolish for the United States to pursue regime change in China. I think that President Biden is under a lot of pressure to improve relations with China. I think that there are a lot of people who are deeply fearful, a lot of people in the United States and in the West more generally, who are deeply fearful that the United States and China are going to get into a real war over Taiwan or over the South China Sea or over the East China Sea. And I think what President Biden and President Xi as well were trying to do was just dampen down the tension between the two countries as much as possible. But I think in the end, it's not going to matter very much. I think Beijing and Washington are destined to have an intense security competition. It will go up and down over time, but there's not much either one of those leaders can do to change the fundamental trajectory that these two countries are on.
I'm coming back to China and Taiwan a little bit on, but I want to ask you about Ukraine. Your lecture in 2015 is really a hit in YouTube with 28 million viewership. And why such a sensation? And what kind of reaction you got when you traveled to Europe or you have been having talks in the States? I mean, why there's so many people want to watch your point of view in terms of Ukraine war?
Well, I think that most people are interested in hearing both sides of an argument. And in the West, all you hear is that Vladimir Putin is an imperialist. Vladimir Putin wanted to conquer Ukraine and make it part of Russia. And that's the end of the story. I have a very different view of what caused the crisis. And I think that the conventional wisdom about Putin's ambitions to conquer Ukraine, that view is wrong. And I challenge that view. And what I think is going on here is people want to hear my view. They want to hear the alternative to the conventional wisdom. And the fact is that it has been for a long time but especially since February 24th of this year, when the war began, for anyone to make the argument that I make. So it's not surprising that lots of people who are trying to understand the war and who want to hear both sides gravitate to my video, because in a way it's the only game in town. At least for a while, it was the only game in town. It was, a good place to go to hear an alternative viewpoint. And I think that is what, in large part, accounts for the fact that it now has almost 28.5 million views, which is truly stunning. I never imagined when I gave the talk in 2015 that this would happen.
Would that make you like a rock star now?
I think there is an element of that. I would note to you that sometimes when I walk through airports, people come up to me and say, "You're John Mearsheimer. I have seen your video on Ukraine."
And after that, would they say they agree with you? I totally disagree with you.
In most cases, what people say is "Thank you very much
for really?
For stating your views clearly and having the courage to make that argument." So there's no question that I get emails. I get lots of emails where people say they agree with me, and I get quite a few emails where people say they disagree with me as well. Most of the emails are from people who are just thanking me for making the argument. I think they realize that it's an unpopular argument and it's not easy to make. So a lot of people will talk about the courage that I have to make this argument. I don't view it as courageous, but if they think that way, that's fine.
Okay.
But I think in a way, the whole situation leaves me with a good feeling, because I have the sense that people want an honest debate. I think in liberal democracies, that should be the name of the game.
Right.
I have an important policy issue that's confronting a country. I think, it's important that people who have studied these things make their views clear. It may be that I'm wrong, it may be that I'm right, but I think you want to get my views out there and the views of other people as well, and have, a knockdown, drag out debate about the whole issue.
I think you are not afraid of controversial, since you have already wrote a book about Israel lobby. I mean, that is quite get a big stir in American foreign policy circle as well, right?
Yeah, I think that all the controversies I've been involved in over my career, and I've been involved in a lot of controversies, there's no question that the controversy over the Israel lobby article and book was by far the most intense.
Right. But I know it's too early to forecast the end game of a Ukraine war, but from your alternative view, what do you think is going to happen? Is it going to be a negotiation for ceasefire, or even the peace treaty is possible? Or does it end up with either Ukraine or Russian prevail in the game?
I honestly don't know. I'm asked this question all the time, and I find it very difficult to predict where this war is headed. One very important point that needs to be made here is that I do not think there is a potential deal that can be realized anytime soon. For example, lots of people say that what we really need here is diplomacy. It's a mistake that the United States is not pushing for a diplomatic solution. And instead, what's happened is diplomacy nowadays in the United States, or in the West more generally, is equated with appeasement. If you say you're in favor of diplomacy, you're accused of being in favor of appeasement. This is crazy, right? We should always be interested in attempting to to find a diplomatic solution to a conflict. But my point is that even if we try diplomacy, there is no viable solution. And there are two problems here. One has to do with the issue of territory, and the other has to do with the issue of neutrality. With regard to territory, the Russians, as you know, have not only conquered and annexed the Crimea, they have now conquered in part, but annexed in full 4 oblasts or 4 regions in the eastern part of Ukraine. So the Russians have formally annexed a big slice of Ukrainian territory, and they have no intention of giving that back. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, and the Americans want that territory to go back to Ukraine. And there's no way you can reach a compromise. Either Ukraine gets the territory or Russia gets the territory. That's the first issue. The second issue is Ukrainian neutrality. The Russians want Ukraine to be a truly neutral state. They do not want Ukraine to be part of NATO. They do not want Ukraine to be part of the European Union. And more generally, they do not want Ukraine to be a Western bulwark on Russia's border. Ukraine says, we accept neutrality. They have said this. We accept neutrality, but we need a security guarantee. Well, the only country that can give Ukraine a security guarantee is the United States, along with its NATO allies. But once the United States and its NATO allies give Ukraine a security guarantee, it's no longer a neutral Ukraine. It's a de facto member of NATO. And the Russians won't accept that. So it's impossible for me to see how you get a negotiated settlement that deals with the issue of territory and deals with the issue of Ukrainian neutrality to the satisfaction of both sides. So I think we're doomed to continue fighting for the foreseeable future.
Watching the Ukraine war from afar, we in Taiwan sometimes try to compare Taiwan with Ukraine and China with Russia. Is the comparison make sense?
Well, I think there's no question that what happens in Ukraine matters for Taiwan. For example, I think that the Chinese now understand that when you launch a military invasion, it doesn't always work out very well. The Russians have not performed well in Ukraine. And China has to say to itself, we have not fought a war since 1979, and launching an amphibious operation across the Taiwan Straits is one of the most difficult military operations one can imagine. Therefore, it's not likely that it will end up well. Second thing I think the Chinese are taking away from this conflict is that it is clear that the Americans are not pussycats. The Americans who have come to the defense of the Ukrainians will come to the defense of Taiwan. So I think those two factors make it unlikely that China will invade Taiwan anytime soon. I think those two aspects of the war in Ukraine that I just described, those two aspects enhance deterrence of a Chinese attack against Taiwan.
But let me ask you, when you visit Taiwan in 2013, after you come back to the States, you wrote the piece, Say Goodbye to Taiwan. But now you seem to have a very, quite a different view concerning the U.S. Involvement with the Taiwan Strait crisis. Is it, have your view changed, or is something that I missed in the argument?
No, my view has not changed at all. I think what happened here is when the National Interest, which was the magazine in which that article was originally published, put it on the internet, put it on the National Interest website, they gave it that title, Goodbye Taiwan, which I think misrepresented my perspective. My argument in the piece was that the United States should defend Taiwan. I've always maintained that the United States should defend Taiwan if it's attacked by China. I said in that piece that if China continued to grow at an impressive economic rate over the coming decades, that China was likely to become so powerful relative to the United States that the United States would not be able to defend Taiwan in the face of a Chinese invasion. Given that China has a much larger population than the United States, if it became very wealthy, much wealthier than it was in 2013 or 2014, right? And it was on the cutting edge in terms of developing sophisticated technologies, and the United States was lagging behind, then the United States would be in real trouble. And that's when the United States would have to say goodbye to Taiwan. It would not be able to defend it. I think now, from the perspective of 2022, that's not likely to happen because the Chinese economy is beginning to struggle somewhat. I don't want to overstate the case. So it doesn't look like we'll reach that point. But regardless, I was saying that for the foreseeable future, the United States needs to be joined at the hip with Taiwan. That's what I believe then. That's what I believe now.
Okay. As you know, that U.S. had a policy of double deterrence on both Taiwan and China. It's named strategy of ambiguity. But now there's more and more pressure from the policy circle as well as the Congress asking for strategy of clarity in order to deter China's military ambitions. What do you think about this?
I think that a strategy of ambivalence is fine as long as you occasionally say things like Joe Biden has done now, that you will defend Taiwan, and then you walk it back. I think it's very important that neither Taiwan nor the United States provoke China into attacking Taiwan by either declaring Taiwanese independence or strongly hinting that the United States supports Taiwanese independence. This is like waving a red flag in front of a bull. You just don't want to do that. It's better to maintain a somewhat ambiguous policy. And I think that Biden understands that. I'm often critical of the Biden administration, especially on Ukraine, but I think in the case of Taiwan, they've played it right. They've not moved away from, the 79 policy. And at the same time, Biden has occasionally said, much to the chagrin of the Chinese, that the United States would defend Taiwan. When I talk to my Chinese friends, they all say that they understand that the United States is going to defend Taiwan. I don't think there's any question about that. And in fact, I think the military to military ties are going to grow over time. And I think that will be sufficient to convince the Chinese that if they attack, they're attacking Godzilla, also known as the United States, right? So you don't need to declare that the old arrangement has changed. You don't need to do that, right? That's my view.
You mentioned your Chinese friend had reacted to your opinion. I understand you also visited China several years ago. And what's your experience in China, and what's the Chinese scholar, especially some of the officials, see your argument in terms of realism?
Well, I have visited Chinese quite a few times. Excuse me, I have visited China quite a few times, and I always enjoy my visits enormously because the Chinese are realists to the core.
Oh, really? Okay.
I sometimes start my talks in China by saying, it's good to be back among my people. And I do not speak one word of Chinese. I cannot even recognize my own name in Chinese. But the Chinese tend to think about international politics much the way I do.
Right.
I find the Chinese academics, students, and policymakers to be realists. That's not to say that they agree with all of my realist views. There are differences for sure, but they are at their core realists, and therefore we speak the same language. So that intellectually, I'm more at home in China than I am in the United States, which is a fundamentally liberal country, as you know. But since I first went to China in 2004 to talk about my book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and to make the argument that China cannot rise peacefully, most Chinese have disagreed with me. They like the fact that I pay attention to China's rise, and they like the fact that I'm often critical of the United States. But the Chinese have long believed that China could rise peacefully. And I have told them they were wrong, that it could not rise peacefully. And I have told the Chinese many times they would be shocked by how ruthless the United States would behave toward China once it became a peer competitor. And at the risk of sounding like I'm bragging, I think I have proved right, and they have proved wrong. I think they now fully understand that the United States has decided that a rising China is a threat to American security, and that the United States will go to great lengths to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon.
Finally, just out of curiosity, in 2015, Taiwan then presidential candidate Tsai Ing-wen, now is the president, she visited you in Chicago. I know you won't talk about the content of discussion, but can you describe how the meeting went? And since now we are facing a coming presidential election in 2024, what kind of suggestion you will have for Taiwan now?
Well, the thing is, I have made the same argument about the rise of China and how Taiwan should relate to China,
right,
and how Taiwan should relate to the United States since the early 2000s. So what I said to her is effectively what I have said to you tonight. I would note to you that I said to President Ma, I had a conversation with President Ma, a one-on-one conversation, when I visited Taiwan. It was 2013 when I visited?
Yes. December.
When I visited in 2013, I had a one-on-one visit with President Ma. And at that point in time, China was deeply interested in facilitating economic intercourse between Taiwan and between China. And I told him I thought that was a mistake. I told him that I thought that Taiwan should do nothing to help China grow more powerful. In effect, what President Ma and Taiwan was doing at the time, what President Ma and China were doing at the time, was pursuing the American policy of engagement. The Americans were also trading with Taiwan, trading with China, helping China to become economically more powerful. The American policymakers believe, the American foreign policy elite, let me say, not the American foreign policy elite, to include its policymakers, believed that by engaging with China, by trading with China and making China more prosperous, China would become a liberal democracy and therefore more peaceful, and we would all live happily ever after. And I believe that President Ma and the Taiwanese elites at the time basically believed the same thing. And I argued that that was foolish, that in fact you were feeding the beast. Taiwan's point of view, a good realist like me thinks it's crazy to turn China into a more powerful country economically, because it will then translate that economic might into military might and threaten Taiwan. And it was, I believe, foolish in the extreme for the United States as well to pursue a policy of engagement, because that just turned China into a peer competitor. And now both Taiwan and the United States have a huge problem with this powerful China that threatens to grow even more powerful. So I have been saying to everybody since the early 2000s that China cannot rise peacefully, and that we should not help it to grow economically more powerful, because then it would grow militarily more powerful. And this is what I have said to various Taiwanese leaders and American leaders, but for the most part, it fell on deaf ears.
And as your suggestion for the future Taiwan, actually what I mean is there are several approaches people have been mentioning. One is balancing, which is close to the United States. The other would be hedging. The other would be bandwagoning, which is close to China. What would be your general approach suggestion would be?
I think for the foreseeable future, Taiwan should balance against China with the United States.
Okay.
The United States is putting together a balancing coalition in East Asia. It emphasizes its bilateral relationships with countries like China, countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and Taiwan should be included in that equation. The United States and Taiwan should have a closer and closer bilateral relationship. And Taiwan should build up its conventional forces in conjunction with the United States so that it has a powerful conventional deterrent. And furthermore, Taiwan should work to do everything possible to get the Americans to place to get the United States to place its nuclear umbrella over Taiwan, so that Taiwan has conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence. That conventional deterrence involves Taiwanese forces and American forces and Japanese forces and Australian forces. But the nuclear deterrence is provided by the United States. But I think that it's in it's in Taiwan's interest to pursue containment. Now, to be clear here, getting back to our earlier discussion about my article that was entitled, was it Goodbye Taiwan? If China becomes so powerful that the United States cannot protect Taiwan, and Taiwan has no choice but to bandwagon.
Okay.
Bandwagoning, as my friend Steve Walt argued in a very important book long ago, bandwagoning only makes sense when you are very weak relative to the threatening country facing you, and you have no other great power or no great power ally that can help you defend yourself. In those circumstances, you should bandwagon. So it may be the case, not likely, but it may be the case if China grows enormously powerful and much more powerful than the United States, that Taiwan has to bandwagon. But that's not the case now, and not the case for the foreseeable future. And therefore, I think Taiwan should balance against China as part of a balancing coalition run by the United States. And as I said to you before, it should go to great lengths to make sure it has conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence.
Thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer. It was very enjoyable talking to you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Chen-Long. And will you send me a copy of the article you write?
Yes, sure. I'll send you a copy, definitely. No problem. And welcome back to Taiwan again to see for yourself how we are doing for the past 8 years.
Yeah, I'd love to come back.
Okay. Thank you, and good night. Okay.
Good night.
Bye.
Well, good morning to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Chen-Long.
Bye.
Bye.
上网搜寻 VIP.U.com 到联合报数位版，看更多精彩的报道。